Security. Remove him. They laughed when the maintenance worker interrupted the board meeting. The chairman called him delusional and ordered security to drag him out in front of investors and executives. Then the single dad calmly whispered 3 words that froze the room. Because the real threat wasn't the man in work boots. It was the one in a tailored suit. Before I show you the exact moment when the boardroom screens exposed the betrayal live, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Beneath the polished glass and million-dollar contracts, something far more dangerous was unfolding, and the only person who saw it wore a maintenance badge. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a fist against the glossy mahogany table. He just stood there in oil-smudged boots, shoulders steady, gaze fixed on the executive screens as if he belonged in that room more than anyone else. Adrian Vale had learned long ago that panic was loud. Competence was quiet. The boardroom smelled like expensive cologne and fresh espresso. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in silver morning light, reflecting off the polished table where Leland Crawford presided like royalty. Her tailored ivory suit was flawless, sharp as her voice. Around her, investors murmured, tablets glowing with acquisition projections worth billions. And then there was him. A contractor's badge clipped to a faded navy work shirt. Utility belt resting low on his hips. A man positioned where power never looked, near the service panel embedded discreetly behind a decorative wall panel, meant for labor, not leadership. He had been replacing a faulty fiber relay when the anomaly flickered across his handheld diagnostic tablet. A ripple in outbound traffic. Small, precise, hidden inside legitimate transfer packets. It wasn't loud enough for standard alerts. But it was deliberate. He felt it the way some men feel a shift in weather pressure before a storm. Patterns were his instinct. Years ago, in rooms far less polished and far more dangerous, that instinct had kept people alive. He glanced through the glass wall of the boardroom. The acquisition presentation was mid-slide. Charts, growth forecasts, applause waiting to happen. And beneath it all, data was bleeding. His jaw tightened. Across town, his daughter was sitting in a second-grade classroom with a rescue inhaler tucked in her backpack. Mila's specialist appointment was in 2 weeks. The company's healthcare partnership funded the clinic that subsidized her treatment. If this acquisition collapsed, or worse, if a breach destroyed investor trust, the layoffs would start at the bottom. Contractors first. He couldn't afford silence. He stepped inside when the next applause cycle faded. The door's soft hiss barely registered over conversation. "Ma'am," he began evenly, eyes on the chairman. "There's irregular outbound traffic routing through the internal board node. It needs to stop, now." Silence fell in fractured pieces. A few executives blinked, confused by the interruption. One investor leaned back, irritated. Leland Crawford's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "There's a live siphon running through your secure infrastructure," he continued, steady as steel. "If it isn't contained, you're about to lose more than this deal." A sharp laugh cut across the table. "Is this some kind of joke?" One director muttered. The chairman's gaze traveled from his worn boots to his grease-stained sleeve. "This meeting is restricted. You fix wiring. That is the extent of your authority." He didn't flinch. With respect, authority doesn't change physics or code. A murmur rolled through the room, offense, disbelief. "Security," she said coldly, pressing a discreet button beneath the table. "Remove him." 2 uniformed guards entered almost instantly, their presence heavy against the glass walls. Investors watched with thin smiles, some already shaking their heads. He could feel the weight of their assumptions. Maintenance, labor, replaceable. One guard reached for his arm. That was when the presentation screen flickered. Just once, subtle, quick. but his eyes locked onto the upper corner where a data transfer icon blinked and vanished. There it is. His pulse slowed instead of rising. Confirmation. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not resisting the guard but not moving either. "The breach is originating from inside this room." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. The chairman's patience snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself." "No," he replied, voice calm, almost gentle. "You're being robbed." A ripple of uneasy laughter tried and failed to form. He turned his gaze deliberately along the table, studying micro-reactions. One board member avoided eye contact. Victor Henshaw, immaculate suit, gold cufflinks shaped like falcons, his tablet screen angled away just slightly too far. Outbound packets surged again, this time larger. Yet personnel in the far corner frowned at their consoles, confusion dawning too late. The guard tightened his grip. "Sir, we need you to step out." He inhaled slowly. He could walk away, keep his job a little longer, pretend he hadn't seen it. But Mila's inhaler flashed in his mind. He met the chairman's eyes once more, then shifted his focus to the guards. "Security," he said softly, gaze settling on Victor without blinking. "Remove him." The room didn't breathe. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then the screens behind them flickered again, longer this time. And every person in that boardroom realized something was very, very wrong. The flicker didn't correct itself this time. Instead, the presentation froze mid-graph, the projected profit curve splitting into digital static before dissolving into a cascade of code that shouldn't have been visible to anyone outside the IT department. A low murmur spread across the table, subtle at first, then sharp with concern. Victor Henshaw's fingers moved quickly over his tablet. Too quickly. Leland Crawford stood from her chair, palms flat against the polished wood. "What is happening?" Her voice cut through the noise, controlled but edged with steel. In the far corner, the IT director adjusted his glasses, tapping frantically at his console. "We're seeing unauthorized outbound transfers," he stammered. "But the firewall's intact. It's coming from an internal node." Adrian didn't move. The guard still had his arm, but the grip had loosened. "I told you," he said evenly. The chairman turned on him. "You're still here?" He held her gaze without challenge, without submission. "Because you need me." A ripple of indignation moved through the board. Investors whispered to one another, some already checking their phones. Panic spreads faster than truth, he thought. He'd seen it before. Victor cleared his throat. "This is absurd. The maintenance contractor creates a disturbance, and suddenly we have a breach? Perhaps he's the one who triggered it." The accusation hung heavy. Several heads turned. Adrian's jaw flexed, but his tone stayed calm. "If I wanted access, I wouldn't do it in front of 40 witnesses." Naomi Rios, seated halfway down the table, glanced between them. Her brow furrowed as she studied the scrolling data now appearing intermittently on the side display. "The timestamps," she murmured. "They started before he entered the room." Victor's expression didn't shift, but his knuckles whitened around the tablet. Leland shot Naomi a warning look, then faced Adrian again. "Even if there is an issue, we have professionals for that." "You do," he agreed. "And they're looking in the wrong place." The IT director looked up, sweat dotting his hairline. "It's embedded in legitimate traffic. Whoever did this knows our infrastructure." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Adrian took one slow step forward, careful, deliberate. The guard hesitated, but didn't stop him. "It's piggybacking on the board's secure acquisition channel," he said. "Layered inside the encrypted file transfers. That's why your alerts aren't triggering. How would you possibly know that?" Victor snapped. "Because I've built it, dismantled it, hunted it." Instead, he answered simply, pattern recognition. Another surge flashed across the screen, larger. Numbers climbed in the corner, data volume increasing. An investor stood abruptly. Is our proprietary research exposed? The IT director swallowed. If this continues, yes. The room fractured into overlapping voices. Leland's composure began to crack just slightly. She rounded the table, heels clicking sharply against marble. Stop it, she ordered Adrian. Whatever stunt you're pulling, stop it. He almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. I'm not the one stealing from you. Victor rose from his seat now, adjusting his cufflinks with forced calm. This is ridiculous. Call the police, remove him. Shut down the network, it's too late for shutdown, Adrian said quietly. Hard disconnect will corrupt your acquisition files. You'll lose everything. The IT director looked at him sharply. He's right, that admission shifted the air. Naomi leaned forward. If it's internal, then someone in this room authorized the channel. Victor's voice sharpened. Are you suggesting? I'm stating facts, she replied, more confident now. Adrian watched the micro-expressions again. Victor's breathing had changed, faster. His tablet screen glowed with an open background application, faint but visible from the angle Adrian stood. There. A mirrored server handshake. He stepped closer to the display wall. Project the internal node activity, he instructed the IT director. Leland bristled. You don't give instructions here, no, he said softly. But I can stop this. The numbers climbed again. The IT director hesitated, then typed rapidly. A secondary screen lit up, raw traffic logs cascading downward. Gasps filled the room. Victor shifted subtly toward the exit. Freeze that, Adrian said. The director obeyed without thinking. A highlighted line blinked in red. Source, Board Access Terminal 7. Every head turned slowly. Terminal 7 sat directly in front of Victor Henshaw. The Falcon cufflinks caught the light as his hand tightened. For the first time, uncertainty cracked through the chairman's authority. Victor? She asked carefully. He laughed, thin, forced. This proves nothing. It could be spoofed. Adrian's voice dropped lower, steady as stone. It's not spoofed. How can you be sure? Leland demanded. He met her eyes again, and this time there was no humility in it. Because I've seen this architecture before. The room stilled around him. If you're still with this story, subscribe now, because what happens next changes everything. Victor's mask slipped just slightly. Enough. Adrian exhaled once, preparing to do what he'd avoided for years, and this time he didn't intend to whisper. The boardroom lights hummed faintly overhead as every pair of eyes fixed on him. Victor remained standing beside Terminal 7, one hand resting too casually on the edge of the table, the other hovering near his tablet like it might still obey him. Leland's expression hardened again, but it wasn't the same certainty as before. It was a calculation now. Risk assessment. Explain yourself, she said. Adrian stepped closer to the secondary screen where the traffic logs remained frozen in red. The guard who had been gripping his arm had fully released him without realizing it. This breach isn't random, he began, voice level. It's a siphon layered inside a mirrored handshake protocol. The outgoing packets are disguised as internal acquisition backups. That's why your firewall sees them as legitimate. The IT director swallowed. That's sophisticated. It's deliberate, he corrected. Victor scoffed. You're throwing around jargon to sound important. Adrian didn't look at him. The encryption key cycling every 12 seconds? That's a military-grade adaptation. The staggered data bursts, designed to avoid volumetric detection. And the access origin? He tapped the highlighted log line. Terminal 7. A silence settled that felt heavier than before. Naomi leaned forward, studying the screen. The authorization token, it's tied to executive credentials. Victor's voice sharpened, which could be cloned. Not with that biometric signature, Adrian replied quietly. Leland's gaze snapped back to him. Biometric? He nodded once. The system logs thumbprint heat variance when authentication occurs. Microtemperature differences. It's subtle, but it's there. The IT director's eyes widened. We never told contractors about that. You didn't, he said evenly. The city skyline glinted behind them, glass reflecting sunlight like indifferent witnesses. In that gleaming room of privilege, the maintenance tech stood steady while tailored suits shifted in discomfort. Victor's composure began to fracture at the edges. This is absurd. Even if my terminal shows activity, it proves nothing. Anyone could have accessed it. Adrian finally looked at him directly. Not during a live board meeting, he said. Your terminal's been active the entire time. Victor's jaw tightened. Are you accusing me? I'm stating what the logs show. The numbers in the corner ticked higher again. Another data burst. The IT director paled. They're accelerating. Panic rippled outward, whispers, chair legs scraping, the faint buzz of phones lighting up with internal alerts. Leland straightened. Authority clawed its way back into her posture. Stop it, she demanded. If you know how to contain this, do it. Now. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes. A memory. Dark rooms lit by single monitors, the weight of national secrets resting on his shoulders, lives measured in keystrokes. He exhaled slowly. I can't just shut it down, he said. If I interrupt mid-cycle, you'll corrupt your acquisition data and alert the external receiver. They'll wipe their endpoint before we can trace it. Naomi looked at him sharply. So what do we do? He moved toward the infrastructure panel near the wall, the one he'd been repairing before this began. He knelt, unsnapping it with practiced ease. Inside, fiber lines glowed faintly, threads of light carrying fortunes. Is he seriously touching our core infrastructure? One investor muttered. Leland hesitated, but she didn't stop him this time. He connected his diagnostic tablet, fingers moving with calm precision. The faint hum of data pulsed through the panel like a heartbeat. Victor's breathing had grown shallower. You're making a mistake, the board member said, voice low now. If you miscalculate, you'll destroy this company. Adrian glanced up at him, expression unreadable. If I do nothing, you will. The IT director stepped closer, drawn by instinct. What are you doing? Mapping the outbound tunnel, he replied. There's a hidden relay embedded 2 layers deep. It's bouncing through a shell server before exiting the country. How can you see that? Naomi asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rerouted a visual feed to the main display. The screen shifted from chaotic logs to a structured network map, clean lines branching outward, one path glowing brighter than the rest. Gasps filled the room. There, he said quietly, pointing. That node doesn't belong. Victor took a subtle step backward. Leland's eyes tracked the glowing path. Trace it, I am. The seconds stretched. Sweat beaded at Victor's temple. The glowing path extended, branching into a masked server cluster registered under an offshore holding company. Naomi read the name aloud. The room froze. Victor's face drained of color. Adrian stood slowly, closing the panel behind him. You asked how I can be sure, he said, voice steady but carrying now. Because I helped design systems like this. I used to hunt breaches exactly like this. The weight of that statement settled across the boardroom. Leland stared at him, something dawning. Who are you? She asked. He met her gaze fully this time. Someone who doesn't steal from his own people. Security shifted uneasily near the door. Victor's composure shattered. This is circumstantial. You can't. Adrian turned toward the guards, voice calm, unwavering. Security, he said again, eyes locked on Victor. Remove him. This time, no one laughed. The guards didn't move immediately, but they didn't hesitate either. Their eyes flicked to Leland Crawford, waiting for the authority that usually came without question. For the first time since the meeting began, she didn't issue an order. Victor's voice cracked through the silence. "You can't be serious." He gestured wildly toward the glowing network map still projected across the wall. "This is a stunt. A fabrication. He's manipulating the display." Adrian stood near the infrastructure panel, shoulders squared but relaxed, as if he were still finishing a routine repair instead of dismantling a board member's power. The hum of the fiber lines behind the wall vibrated faintly, almost like a pulse beneath skin. "The data is live," he said calmly. "Every transfer is time-stamped, every handshake logged." Victor turned sharply to the IT director. "Shut it down. Pull the feed." The director hesitated, fingers hovering uselessly above his keyboard. "I can't," he admitted. "If I cut the session abruptly, we lose trace continuity." Naomi stepped closer to the screen, eyes scanning the server registration details. "The offshore holding company," she said quietly. "It was incorporated 3 months ago." 3 months. The same week the acquisition negotiations began. A murmur rippled through the investors, anger now replacing confusion. Victor's composure thinned further. Coincidences happen. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Not at this scale. The numbers in the upper corner continued climbing, data packets streaming outward in steady, calculated bursts. The breach hadn't stopped. Leland moved slowly around the table, heels echoing sharply against marble. She stopped directly across from Adrian, close enough to see the faint scar near his temple, the steadiness in his eyes. "You said you can contain it," she stated. "I can isolate the relay and reroute the tunnel into a dead-end loop," he replied. "But once I do, the external receiver will know they've been detected." Victor's jaw tightened. "Then don't." That single word betrayed more than denial ever could. The chairman's gaze snapped toward him. Adrian didn't look away from her. "If I don't act in the next 90 seconds, you'll lose everything tied to this acquisition. Proprietary algorithms, financial forecasts, internal strategy. It'll be on a competitor's desk before sunset." The weight of that reality settled visibly across the room. Leland inhaled slowly. Power had always been her advantage, decisive, sharp, unquestioned. But this decision didn't belong to dominance. It belonged to survival. "Do it," she said. Victor took a step back. "You can't authorize him. I just did." The guards shifted position instinctively, now closer to Victor than to Adrian. He dropped back to one knee at the panel, tablet already alive with cascading code. The glow reflected faintly against his face, steady and focused. His fingers moved without panic, rerouting pathways, isolating encryption layers. The room felt suspended in air. Naomi watched the screen as the glowing path began to narrow. "He's boxing it in," she whispered. Victor's breathing grew uneven. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," he muttered, though no one seemed to be listening anymore. The hum inside the wall deepened slightly as traffic redirected. 10 seconds, Adrian said quietly. On the display, the outbound stream flickered, then stalled. Gasps filled the boardroom. The bright path on the network map blinked, then collapsed into a contained loop highlighted in amber. "It's trapped," the IT director breathed. Silence followed. Heavy. Electric. Victor lunged suddenly toward his tablet. "Stop him," Leland ordered sharply. One of the guards intercepted Victor's arm before he could touch the device. The tablet slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the polished floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Adrian rose slowly. "Don't damage that," he said evenly. "It's evidence." Victor's mask shattered entirely now. "You think this proves anything? I can explain every line on that screen." Naomi bent down, retrieving the tablet carefully. The display was still active, an encrypted dashboard mid-session. She looked up at Leland, voice steady despite the tension. It's logged into the same offshore server. The chairman's face went pale, not with shock but with realization. Investors were no longer whispering. They were watching. Public. Witnessed. Irreversible. Victor's voice turned desperate. This is corporate espionage. We can settle this quietly. Adrian met his eyes. You already tried. Leland straightened, authority returning but reshaped. Not arrogance. Control forged under fire. Security, she said, her tone now iron instead of ice. Escort Mr. Henshaw to a private holding room. Contact legal and law enforcement immediately. The guards didn't hesitate this time. Victor struggled briefly, then stilled as the weight of inevitability settled over him. His falcon cufflinks caught the light one last time before he was turned toward the door. As he was led past Adrian, their shoulders nearly brushed. You have no idea what you've started, Victor hissed. Adrian didn't blink. I finished it. The doors closed behind the disgraced board member with a soft, final click. The glowing network map faded from red to stable green. In the sudden quiet, the reality of what had just happened pressed against every person in the room. Leland turned slowly toward the man she had ordered, removed only minutes earlier. The power dynamic had shifted. And everyone knew it. The boardroom doors had barely finished closing behind Victor when the silence changed shape. It wasn't a shock anymore. It was a recalibration. Investors who had been whispering were now studying the man in the oil-smudged boots as if seeing him for the first time. The network map remained projected across the wall, amber containment loop steady, controlled. The breach was boxed in but not gone. The IT director cleared his throat. The external endpoint is still pinging. Whoever was receiving the data knows something's changed. Adrian nodded once. They'll try to trigger a wipe. Naomi's fingers tightened around Victor's confiscated tablet. Can they destroy the evidence remotely? They can try, he said. But I rerouted the tunnel through an internal mirror before isolating it. Every packet's duplicated locally. Leland studied him carefully now. Not dismissive, not mocking, assessing. How long do we have? She asked. Minutes, he replied. Maybe less. The air felt heavier than before. Not humiliation. Pressure. Across the table, one investor spoke up. We need assurance this acquisition isn't compromised. It is, the IT director admitted weakly. Adrian stepped toward the main console. Not entirely. Heads turned again. If the siphon's been active since negotiations began, he continued, they've already extracted projections and models, but they don't have the final integration architecture. That file hasn't transferred yet. Naomi looked up sharply. Because it wasn't unlocked, he gave a slight nod. And because it requires dual authorization, Leland's eyes narrowed. Mine and Victor's, yes. A quiet understanding passed across her face. The chairman walked to the head of the table slowly, heels measured against marble. If that file transfers, she said, the deal collapses. And your competitors gain leverage, Adrian finished. The IT director swallowed. The system's attempting another outbound handshake. On the screen, the amber containment loop flickered. They're probing for an exit, Naomi murmured. Adrian moved back toward the infrastructure panel, reconnecting his tablet with swift precision. The hum behind the wall deepened again, almost like a warning. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. You've done this before, Leland said quietly, almost to herself. He didn't look up. Yes. In the military? Naomi asked. A brief pause. Intelligence, he answered simply. That single word landed differently than any technical explanation could. The IT director blinked. You're not just a contractor. No, he said, I'm just a father. The room absorbed that. Outside the glass walls, employees continued walking the executive floor, unaware of how close the company had come to collapse. Sunlight reflected off skyscrapers in the distance, indifferent and bright. The amber loop flashed red for a split second. There, he said calmly. They're escalating. What happens if they succeed? An investor asked. The relay self-destructs, Adrian replied. Encrypted logs purge. Offshore server wipes, Naomi inhaled sharply. Then we lose our proof. Yes. Leland stepped closer, lowering her voice. Can you stop it? He studied the traffic pattern, eyes moving quickly but deliberately. I can counter-trigger their wipe command. Force it to misfire. The IT director stared. That's risky. He gave a faint shrug. So is losing everything. The numbers in the corner spiked. Do it, Leland said again, this time without hesitation. His fingers moved in a controlled rhythm, rerouting code, injecting a timed delay into the mirrored handshake. The network map split into two glowing paths, one false, one real. They'll think their wipe succeeded, he explained, but the internal mirror will preserve the logs. A bead of sweat rolled down the IT director's temple. Naomi watched the screen without blinking. 3, 2, 1. The red flash surged, then disappeared. The outbound endpoint went dark. The room exhaled as one. It's gone, the IT director whispered. Adrian didn't celebrate. He scanned the logs once more, confirming containment, ensuring no residual channel remained open. It's contained, he said finally. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different. Not fear, recognition. If you've made it this far, subscribe, because what just happened is only the beginning. Leland stepped forward, closer than before. There was no mockery left in her posture. You saved this company, she said quietly. He closed the infrastructure panel, snapping it back into place as if finishing a routine repair. I stopped a theft, he corrected. Across the table, investors were no longer whispering about removing him. They were whispering about what would have happened if he hadn't been there at all. Naomi handed the confiscated tablet to legal counsel, who had just entered the room in a hurry. Chain of custody, she instructed. The IT director approached Adrian cautiously. Why didn't you tell anyone about your background? He wiped his hands on a clean cloth from his belt. No one asked. That answer lingered. Leland studied him for a long moment. The class divide that had defined the first half of the meeting felt fragile now, thin as glass. You said you designed systems like this, she said. Why are you repairing fiber lines? He looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. Because stability matters more than status. Her gaze sharpened slightly. Stability for who? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small inhaler, blue plastic, worn at the edges. For my daughter, he said softly. The room shifted again. Power had met purpose. And it had lost. The inhaler rested in his palm for only a second before he slipped it back into his pocket. The gesture was small, almost private, but in the silence of that boardroom it felt louder than the breach alarms had. Leland noticed. Her gaze dropped briefly to his pocket, then returned to his face. Something in her posture changed, not softened, not weakened, but recalibrated. Your daughter, she said carefully. She depends on this company's medical program? He nodded once. The partnership with St. Gabriel's Pediatric Clinic. Without it, he let the sentence trail off. He didn't need to finish. Naomi swallowed. That clinic treats half the city's low-income kids. And if the acquisition collapsed, Adrian continued evenly, funding would have been the first thing questioned. An investor shifted uncomfortably. The numbers on spreadsheets had faces now. Leland straightened slowly. You stepped into a restricted executive meeting knowing you could lose your job. I assumed I already had, he replied. The honesty of that answer lingered longer than any technical explanation had. The IT director cleared his throat. Legal is securing Mr. Henshaw in a holding room. Law enforcement's on the way. Good, Leland said. Then, after a brief pause, lock down all executive terminals. No one leaves this floor without clearance. Her voice had regained its authority, but it carried weight now, not arrogance. Adrian leaned lightly against the wall near the service panel, the adrenaline finally ebbing from his system. The room smelled faintly of overheated electronics and polished wood. Beyond the glass, city traffic hummed far below, unaware of how close a corporate implosion had come. Naomi approached him carefully. You rerouted a military-grade siphon in under 5 minutes. He gave a faint shrug. It wasn't my first time. You were intelligence, she pressed. Yes. For how long? Long enough. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully, then why leave? A muscle in his jaw tightened, just slightly. Because missions end. Parenthood doesn't. That answer settled into the air between them. Across the table, investors began speaking in hushed but urgent tones about damage control, press strategy, containment narratives. The machine of corporate survival was already spinning again. Leland raised a hand, silencing them. There will be no narrative manipulation, she said firmly. We were infiltrated. We respond with transparency. A few startled glances met her words. Adrian watched her quietly. That wasn't the choice he would have expected from her an hour ago. She walked toward him again, heels steady, but no longer sharp with disdain. Up close, she seemed smaller somehow, not in stature, but in certainty. I misjudged you, she said plainly. He didn't rush to absolve her. You judged the uniform, yes. The admission cost her something. It showed. I built this company on discipline and precision, she continued. I assumed those qualities came dressed in certain ways. He glanced down at his worn boots. Precision doesn't care what you're wearing. A faint, almost reluctant breath of something like agreement escaped her. Security returned briefly, informing the chairman that Victor was cooperating minimally, but refusing formal statements until legal counsel arrived. The Falcon cufflinks had been removed and catalogued as evidence. Poetic, Adrian thought. Naomi stepped closer to the main display again. The mirrored logs are secure in 3 internal backups, she reported. They can't erase this. They'll try to claim ignorance, Adrian said. Can they? She asked. No. His voice was calm but absolute. The biometric heat variance proves continuous physical authentication. He never logged out. Leland absorbed that. Which means premeditation. Yes. The weight of betrayal settled deeper now, not just financial, but personal. A board member. A trusted executive, inside the room. Leland exhaled slowly. I chose him. That's what infiltration relies on, Adrian replied. Trust. Her eyes met his again, sharper this time, not with hostility, but with understanding. You were trained to see what others overlook. I was trained to notice what doesn't fit. And I didn't, she admitted. Outside the boardroom, word was already spreading. Employees gathered subtly near the glass walls, sensing something extraordinary had occurred. The maintenance contractor was no longer invisible. An assistant approached Leland cautiously. Press inquiries are beginning, she said. Of course they are, Leland murmured. Naomi turned to Adrian. You realize you'll be asked to testify, he nodded. I figured. You're prepared for that? I've testified before. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't press further. The chairman folded her hands behind her back, studying the skyline. This company nearly lost everything because I dismissed the person standing closest to the truth. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. After a long moment, she turned back to him. "I would like you to remain," she said, "not as maintenance." The implication hung there. He tilted his head slightly. "Doing what?" "Advising. Overseeing internal security restructuring. Directly reporting to me." The room stilled again. The same board that had watched him be humiliated was now witnessing an offer. He didn't answer immediately, because for him, this wasn't about status. It was about whether stepping forward would secure the one thing that mattered most. The boardroom felt smaller now, as if the glass walls had drawn inward around the decision forming in his chest. Investors watched with restrained curiosity. Executives waited. Naomi stood near the display screen, still holding the evidence logs like something fragile but powerful. Leland's offer lingered between them. "Directly reporting to you," he repeated quietly. "Yes," she said, "full authority to audit internal systems, rebuild them, prevent this from ever happening again." He studied her face carefully. The arrogance from earlier had burned off, leaving something harder earned humility. "And what happens when it's inconvenient?" he asked. A faint crease formed between her brows. "Inconvenient? When the audit implicates someone profitable or politically useful." The room shifted uncomfortably. Naomi glanced at Leland, waiting. The chairman didn't look away. "Then we removed them." A beat passed. He believed she meant it, or at least that she did in this moment. The city skyline glowed beyond the glass, afternoon light stretching long shadows across polished floors. He imagined Mila at home later, swinging her backpack onto the kitchen chair, asking how his day went. He imagined answering that question. "Stability matters more than status," Leland said, repeating his words from earlier. His eyes narrowed slightly. "It does." "Then help me protect it." There it was again, purpose meeting power. Naomi stepped forward. "If he hadn't been here, we'd be issuing bankruptcy statements by tonight." The blunt truth settled heavily. One investor cleared his throat. "We need someone who understands asymmetric threats." Clearly, another nodded reluctantly. "And someone who isn't dazzled by titles." A faint ripple of uncomfortable acknowledgement followed that comment. He felt the weight of their gazes. For years, he'd chosen the background, night shifts, contract roles. Repair calls no one remembered. Invisible was safe. But invisible almost cost his daughter her clinic. He looked at Leland again. "If I accept, I do it my way." "Define that," she said. "Independent oversight. No interference. No shielding executives from findings." A few board members stiffened. She didn't hesitate. "Agreed, and healthcare security for contractors under my division," he added calmly, "not just executives." That caught them off guard. Naomi's eyes flickered with approval. Leland tilted her head slightly. "You negotiate boldly. I negotiate for people who don't get invited to this table." Silence followed. A different kind this time, reflective, unsettled. The chairman glanced at the investors, then back at him. "Done." A subtle but irreversible shift passed through the room. The maintenance contractor had just reshaped executive policy. He exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. "Then I'll stay." Naomi allowed herself a small breath of relief. The IT director stepped forward, extending a hand almost hesitantly. "We could use someone who sees the patterns we miss." He shook it firmly. "We all miss something. That's why systems need challenge." Across the room, legal counsel returned with a quiet update. "Law enforcement is on site. Mr. Henshaw is requesting representation." "Of course he is," Leland said coolly. She turned to Adrian again. "You'll need to brief them. Walk them through what you uncovered." He nodded. I'll provide the logs and technical explanation. As he moved toward the main console again, he caught his reflection faintly in the glass wall. Same boots, same worn shirt, same man. But the way the room looked at him had changed. Employees had begun gathering outside the boardroom doors, whispering. Word had spread quickly. Maintenance had unmasked a board member. Poetic justice rarely announced itself so clearly. Naomi joined him at the console. You didn't have to negotiate for contractors, she said quietly. Yes, I did. Her expression softened. Most people would have asked for a title. I asked for coverage. For your daughter. For everyone's daughter, he corrected. The amber containment loop on the display had fully stabilized now, archived logs secured in internal backups. The crisis had passed, but the consequences were just beginning. Leland addressed the room one final time before stepping out to face law enforcement. Today we were reminded that expertise doesn't always sit at the head of the table. No one argued. She paused, then added, and neither does integrity. When she left the boardroom, the space felt less like a throne room and more like a workplace. He gathered his diagnostic tablet, sliding it back into his utility belt. The physical weight grounded him. Naomi studied him thoughtfully. You know this changes everything. It should, he said. Outside the glass, employees parted as he stepped into the corridor. Some nodded, some looked stunned. A few even looked grateful. The service panel near the wall remained slightly scuffed from earlier. He ran his hand over it briefly, remembering where he'd been standing when the breach first flickered. Power never looks there. But it should. Behind him, the boardroom doors opened again as security escorted Victor past the gathering employees. The former board member's eyes flicked toward him, anger, disbelief, something broken. He didn't gloat. He simply held the gaze for a moment, steady and unshaken. Then he turned back toward the executive floor. Because the real work, rebuilding trust, was just beginning. The corridor outside the boardroom buzzed with restrained energy. Employees who had once walked past him without eye contact now stepped aside instinctively. Whispers followed in his wake, not mocking this time, but curious, cautious, almost respectful. Victor was being escorted the opposite direction, hands no longer struggling, shoulders rigid with humiliation. The falcon cufflinks were gone. His wrists looked strangely bare. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met again. There was no apology in Victor's stare, only disbelief that someone he'd considered invisible had dismantled him in public. Poetic justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Inside the boardroom, Leland addressed the remaining executives. Her voice carried through the partially open doors. This company survives because someone we dismissed refused to stay silent. No one argued. Naomi stepped beside him near the service corridor junction. Law enforcement wants your statement in conference room C. He nodded. Let's finish this cleanly. They walked side by side past the executive lounge, the same space where he'd once been told to use the service elevator instead of the main lift. The scent of espresso still lingered in the air, but it no longer felt suffocating. You handled that with restraint, Naomi said quietly. I handled it with evidence, he replied. She studied him for a moment. Most people in your position would have humiliated him the way he tried to humiliate you. He adjusted the strap on his tablet case. Humiliation doesn't build stability. Conference room C was smaller, windowless, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Two detectives sat at the polished table, notebooks open. Victor was seated at the far end with legal counsel, posture stiff, expression carefully neutral again. Adrian took a seat opposite them. Mr. Vale, one detective began, walk us through how you identified the breach. He did. Methodical. Precise. He described the staggered packet bursts, the mirrored handshake, the biometric variants. His voice remained calm, controlled, never accusatory, only factual. Victor's attorney interrupted once. "Speculation. It's logged," he replied evenly, sliding a printed export of the traffic logs across the table. "Timestamps align with continuous terminal activity." The detective nodded slowly. "And you contained it?" "Yes." "How?" He outlined the counter-trigger injection and mirrored archive preservation. No theatrics, just competence. Victor shifted in his chair. "He's embellishing. Contractors don't have that level of access." Naomi, standing near the door, spoke clearly. He didn't need access. He understood the infrastructure. Silence followed that. After another round of questions, the detectives gathered their materials. "We'll be seizing the executive terminals and Mr. Henshaw's personal devices," one said. Victor's composure cracked slightly at that. As security escorted him out again, this time toward formal custody, employees in the hallway watched openly. The fall from tailored power to escorted suspect happened under full witness. Public exposure. Complete. If you've been following this story, subscribe now, because accountability only matters when it's seen. The corridor quieted after Victor disappeared around the corner. Leland approached, expression steady but thoughtful. "The press will have fragments of this by evening," she said. "We'll release a statement acknowledging internal misconduct and corrective action." "Truth works faster than spin," he replied. She gave a faint nod. "You've altered more than our security protocols today. That was your choice," he said gently. "You could have doubled down." Her gaze sharpened slightly. "I nearly did, but you didn't." The admission hung between them. Naomi glanced at the maintenance badge still clipped to his shirt. "You're going to need a new ID." He looked down at it, worn plastic, edges slightly cracked. It had open doors meant for labor. "It still works," he said. "For now," she replied with a small smile. Through the glass wall at the end of the corridor, the skyline glowed in late afternoon light. The city looked unchanged, unaware of the fracture that had just occurred inside this tower. Leland folded her arms thoughtfully. "Tomorrow we begin a full audit." "You'll lead it?" He nodded once. "We start with privilege mapping. Any executive with unchecked terminal access gets reviewed." A few nearby managers stiffened at that. She noticed and didn't retract the decision. "Send a message," she said quietly. "Competence outranks title." He felt something settle inside him, not pride, not triumph. Alignment. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Milla's teacher. "She used her inhaler today but is fine." He closed his eyes briefly in relief. Stability. That was always the mission. When he opened them again, the executive floor looked different. Not because the glass had changed or the marble floors had dulled, but because power had shifted its gaze, and this time it was finally looking where it never had before. The executive floor slowly emptied as law enforcement completed their sweep. Terminals were disconnected. Devices cataloged. Conversations dropped to hushed tones as employees processed what they had witnessed. He remained near the service corridor for a moment longer, watching the ripple effect unfold. One junior analyst began, then paused. "Sir," he wasn't used to that. Naomi noticed the hesitation and stepped beside him. "They're recalibrating," she murmured. "Good," he replied. "They should." Leland returned from a brief call with legal counsel, her expression composed but focused. "The board has voted to suspend Victor pending criminal investigation," she said. "Unanimously." "Unanimous now," Naomi observed quietly. Leland didn't deny it. She turned her attention fully to him. "HR will draft the formal advisory role by morning. Interim authority begins immediately." He gave a short nod. "Then we start tonight. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Tonight? The breach may be contained, he said, but infiltration rarely travels alone. If one executive built a siphon, others may have left doors open. The IT director, overhearing, stiffened. You think there's more? I think complacency spreads. That landed harder than an accusation. Naomi crossed her arms thoughtfully. What's first? Privilege escalation review, he answered. I want a full map of access tiers across executive terminals. Physical and digital. The director hesitated. That's sensitive, so was today. Silence followed that. Employees nearby were pretending not to listen, but their attention lingered. The maintenance contractor now issuing directives was an image none of them would forget. Leland studied him carefully. You're not interested in the title, are you? No. The office? He glanced briefly toward the corner suite with the skyline view. I've worked in rooms without windows, he said. View doesn't change responsibility. She absorbed that quietly. Naomi stepped closer, lowering her voice. There's something else. He looked at her. When we cross-checked Victor's credentials just now, she said, his access privileges were expanded 3 months ago. The week negotiations began, he replied. Yes, but the expansion wasn't approved by him. His gaze sharpened. Who signed off? Naomi hesitated. You did. He frowned. I wasn't here 3 months ago, I know, she said quickly. But the authorization code traces back to a temporary security consultant who left shortly after. A faint pulse of memory stirred. Name? He asked. She checked her tablet. The file lists an A. Vale. The air shifted again. Leland's eyes narrowed. Is that coincidence? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for Naomi's tablet, scrolling through the archived consultant profile. The photograph was grainy, partial face obscured by shadow, but the signature algorithm used in the authorization key, he recognized that. Not his code, but modeled after his. They used my former credentials as a template, he said quietly. Naomi looked up. To bypass deeper scrutiny, yes. Leland's voice dropped lower, meaning this was planned by someone who knew your past. He exhaled slowly. Military intelligence wasn't a career that disappeared cleanly. It left echoes. Enemies. Unfinished threads. This wasn't random corporate greed, he said. It was strategic. The IT director swallowed. You think Victor was working alone? I think he was useful. The room seemed to tilt slightly under that realization. Leland folded her arms. If this extends beyond him, it probably does. Naomi's expression hardened. Then the audit just became more urgent, he nodded. Pull the consultant's onboarding records. Cross-reference with vendor contracts. The IT director hesitated again. That will require board clearance. Leland didn't blink. You have it. The shift was undeniable now. Authority flowed differently, less insulated, more accountable. An assistant approached nervously. The press statement is drafted. Leland accepted the tablet, scanning quickly. Remove the phrase isolated incident, she said. We don't know that yet. The assistant nodded and hurried away. He glanced once more toward the skyline, then back at the executive floor now humming with controlled urgency. The crisis had evolved. What began as exposure had uncovered something deeper, intentional infiltration using fragments of his own past. Naomi studied him carefully. Are you worried? He considered the question. Yes, he said honestly. But not about today. About your daughter? About whoever thinks using my name is leverage. Leland stepped closer, voice steady. If someone targeted this company through you, they miscalculated, he finished quietly. Because now he wasn't invisible anymore. and whoever had hidden behind that shadowed consultant profile had just made the worst possible mistake. They'd stepped into his battlefield. The executive floor no longer felt like unfamiliar territory. It felt mapped, angles measured, patterns traced, weaknesses catalogued. The hum of servers behind the walls carried a rhythm he understood better than polished speeches or quarterly forecasts. Naomi stood beside him as the consultant file remained open on her tablet. The onboarding records show limited clearance, she said, just enough to modify privilege tiers. Temporary credentials, he murmured, disposable. Leland crossed her arms, gaze sharp. And modeled after yours, yes. The weight of that fact pressed against the room. Who outside this company knows your background? She asked. Very few, he replied. And fewer still who'd have motive. Naomi studied the consultant's login timestamps. The activity spikes line up with key negotiation milestones. Whoever created this access wanted long-term extraction, not a smash and grab. Which means patience, he said. And confidence, Leland added. The IT director shifted uncomfortably. Are we dealing with corporate espionage or something larger? He didn't answer immediately. He zoomed into the authorization string embedded in the consultant's profile. A sequence of characters most eyes would skim past. But he didn't skim. There, he said quietly. Naomi leaned closer. What is it? Signature drift, she frowned. Explain. When you replicate someone's coding style, he said, you imitate structure but tiny habits slip through. Timing intervals, syntax spacing. Choice of fallback protocols, Leland watched him closely. And this isn't a corporate programmer, the room stilled. It's trained, he continued. Government trained. Naomi's expression tightened. Foreign? He gave a small nod. Possibly, or private contractor with state background. The IT director swallowed audibly. Leland paced once along the length of the glass wall, heels echoing softly. If this breach ties back to a larger network, our exposure isn't just financial. No, he agreed. It's reputational and strategic. She stopped pacing. What do you need? Time. Full system access. And discretion. You have it? Naomi hesitated. If this is external intelligence, won't containing it quietly make us look complicit later? He shook his head. We contain first. Report second. Chaos benefits whoever started this. That logic landed. The executive floor buzzed with controlled motion as teams began internal audits under his direction. Terminals lit up across departments, access maps projected onto secure monitors. He walked through it methodically, issuing calm instructions. Strip redundant privileges. Lock dormant credentials. Flag third-party vendors for review. The same employees who once barely acknowledged him now moved quickly at his word. Power had shifted, but it wasn't loud. It was efficient. Leland rejoined him near the central operations console. The press is escalating, she said quietly. They're calling it executive betrayal. It was, he replied. And more? Possibly. She studied him for a moment. You're not surprised by this, no, because you've seen infiltration before. Yes, the honesty didn't rattle him anymore. Naomi approached, urgency in her step. We found something else. She projected a timeline across the screen. The consultant account had accessed internal infrastructure diagrams, specifically the fiber relay architecture behind the executive boardroom. He felt a faint tightening in his chest. They studied the physical layout, she said. Which means they anticipated needing proximity, he finished. Leland's eyes narrowed. Proximity to what? To me, silence settled heavily. Naomi's voice dropped. You think this was a trap? He considered that carefully. No, he said after a moment. Not a trap. A contingency. For the possibility I'd notice. The implication hung there. The consultant account had embedded just enough authorization to expand Victor's privileges, but left behind code fingerprints resembling his own. If anyone investigated deeply, suspicion might drift toward him. Preemptive misdirection. Leland's jaw tightened. They intended to frame you, yes. The IT director exhaled shakily. But you caught it before it could point back, because I wasn't supposed to be here, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I wasn't scheduled on this floor today. I swapped shifts. Why? She asked. He reached into his pocket again, not for the inhaler this time, but for his phone. The text from Mila's teacher remained visible. She had a mild episode this morning, he said. I wanted to leave early for her appointment next week, so I traded with another tech. A small decision. A father's instinct, and because of that shift swap, he had been present when the breach activated. Leland absorbed that slowly. So whoever built this contingency didn't anticipate you being on site? No. And if you hadn't been? He met her gaze steadily. You'd have lost everything. The room felt colder somehow. Naomi folded her arms. Then we're not just cleaning up a betrayal. We're disrupting someone's larger plan. Yes. Leland straightened, authority reforged under clarity rather than pride. Then we finish what they started. He nodded once. Outside the glass walls, dusk began to fall over the city, lights flickering on in distant towers. The battlefield had expanded. And this time he wasn't just defending a company, he was defending his name. Dusk pressed against the glass walls, turning the skyline into a grid of flickering lights. Inside the executive floor, the glow from monitors replaced sunlight. The atmosphere had shifted from crisis to controlled pursuit. Access maps filled the central display, layers of privileges, vendor pathways, authentication chains. What once looked like an orderly structure now revealed subtle fractures. Naomi stood beside him, arms folded as she reviewed flagged accounts. We isolated 3 vendor contracts approved during the same week as the consultant profile, she said. All minor infrastructure audits, all unnecessary. Shell entries, he replied. Legitimate enough to pass, quiet enough to avoid scrutiny. The IT director rubbed his temples. How many back doors did we miss? He didn't soften the answer. We don't know yet. Leland approached from the far end of the room, jacket removed, sleeves rolled. The transformation from distant executive to engaged leader was unmistakable. Law enforcement confirmed Victor's offshore account activity, she said. It aligns with the siphon transfers. Good, he replied. That keeps the criminal charge clean. But they also confirmed something else. Her voice lowered slightly. The offshore holding company traces to a private intelligence brokerage. Naomi stiffened. State-backed? Unclear, Leland answered. But not amateur, he nodded slowly. It matched what he'd seen in the code. They weren't stealing for resale, he said. They were harvesting leverage for negotiation pressure? Naomi asked. Yes. Or acquisition sabotage, the IT director exhaled. So the goal wasn't to bankrupt us, no, he replied. It was to weaken you. Leland met his eyes. And frame you if necessary. Yes, the room absorbed that quietly. He moved to the console again, zooming into one of the flagged vendor contracts. The digital signature pattern mirrored the earlier consultant drift, subtle spacing anomalies, timestamp rhythm irregularities. There's your link, he said. Naomi leaned closer. Same author. Same training, the IT director looked uneasy. If this group operates internationally, they do, he interrupted gently. Leland studied him carefully. You recognize them? A pause. I recognize the methodology, he clarified. Layered infiltration, plausible deniability. Frame the internal scapegoat if exposed, and you were the contingency scapegoat? Yes. Silence deepened. Naomi's expression hardened. Then we go public with everything. Transparency protects you. It protects the company, he corrected. And you, she insisted. He didn't argue. Leland stepped closer, her voice firm but measured. You stepped into humiliation to protect this organization. I won't allow it to quietly turn against you. The sincerity in her tone was unmistakable. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once, released the consultant file, highlight the forged authorization chain, make it clear the breach predated my involvement. She didn't hesitate. Done. The IT director hesitated. That could attract attention from higher authorities at will, he said. And that's good. Why? Naomi asked. Because whoever orchestrated this will know we traced them. They'll adjust. And that helps us how? It forces them to reveal their next move. The battlefield expanded again, not through panic, but strategy. Outside the operations console, several department heads waited for instruction. He addressed them calmly. Immediate protocol changes. Dual authorization on all executive terminals. Vendor audits within 48 hours. No exceptions. They nodded quickly. Leland watched the exchange, a faint realization crossing her face. You don't command loudly, she observed. No need. Naomi smiled slightly. He commands with clarity. The maintenance badge still hung against his shirt. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, it looked almost symbolic, proof of where power had overlooked. Leland reached toward it, fingers brushing the plastic edge lightly. We'll replace this tomorrow. He looked down at it, then back up at her. Keep it, he said. It reminds people where the breach was found. Her lips curved faintly. In the place meant for labor, yes, the room felt steadier now, grounded. His phone buzzed again. A photo from Mila's teacher this time. A crayon drawing of a tall stick figure with a tool belt standing in front of a large building, a small figure beside him holding a blue inhaler. He stared at it for a long moment. Naomi noticed the shift in his expression. She okay? She's fine, he said softly. She thinks I fix buildings. Leland's gaze softened slightly. You do. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Outside, night had fully fallen. The city lights shimmered like distant code patterns, complex, interconnected, fragile. Leland turned to the room. We move forward with full disclosure. No internal cover-ups. No quiet settlements. A few executives shifted nervously. She didn't waver. He felt something settle into place, not triumph, not vindication. Alignment between purpose and power. Naomi stepped beside him. You realize this will follow you, she said quietly. The intelligence network. The exposure. He nodded. It already did, and you're staying anyway? Yes, for stability, she guessed. For Mila. Leland extended her hand, not as a superior, but as an equal. Then we rebuild this properly, he took it firmly, not as maintenance, not as intelligence, but as a father who refused to let power decide who mattered. The handshake held for a moment longer than protocol required, and when they were released, the hierarchy felt permanently altered. Night settled fully over the city by the time he stepped out of the tower. The executive floor lights glowed behind him, no longer symbols of distance but reminders of what had shifted inside those glass walls. The air outside was cooler, quieter. He loosened the strap of his utility belt slightly as he walked toward the parking structure. The maintenance badge still rested against his chest. Tomorrow, they'll issue a new one. Tonight, it stayed. His phone buzzed again, this time a short message from Mila's teacher confirming she'd gone home smiling. Relief settled into his bones like gravity finally returning after suspension. He drove through city streets that felt unchanged by what had happened. Traffic lights blinked. people crossed intersections unaware that a corporate collapse had been stopped hours earlier by someone they might have overlooked without a second thought. At a red light, he caught his reflection faintly in the windshield. Same worn boots, same steady eyes, same quiet resolve. Only the weight had shifted. When he reached the modest apartment building, the hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and warm food. Familiar, grounded, real. The door swung open before he could knock. "Daddy." Mila ran into him, arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He crouched instinctively, holding her close, breathing in the clean scent of her shampoo. The inhaler clipped to her pajama pocket brushed lightly against his side. "You're late," she said, peering up at him with curious eyes. "Did you fix something big?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, something big. Bigger than the elevator?" "Much bigger." She studied him seriously, then nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Good. You're the best fixer." He swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "I try." Inside, the apartment felt small compared to the glass tower, but warmer. A drawing sat on the kitchen table, crayon lines bright and uneven. A tall stick figure with a tool belt stood beside a building with shining windows. "That's you," she explained proudly. "You fix buildings so people are safe." He looked at the drawing longer than necessary. "Something like that," he said softly. Later, after she fell asleep, he stood by the living room window watching the distant skyline shimmer. Somewhere inside that grid of lights, executives were restructuring protocols. Legal teams were filing charges. Press statements were being released with his name no longer questioned, but cleared. Public exposure had done its work. Poetic justice had followed. But none of it mattered as much as the quiet breathing from the bedroom down the hall. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from Naomi, press release live, full transparency. "You're credited." He typed back a simple reply, "Good." A moment later, another message arrived from Leland. "Thank you for staying." He stared at it briefly before responding. Stability matters. The typing bubble appeared, paused, then disappeared. No reply came. He didn't need one. Across the city, headlines began forming. Board member arrested. Internal security failure exposed. Maintenance contractor turned whistleblower. They'd get the details wrong. They always did. Because this wasn't a story about a contractor outsmarting a board. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about power-shifting hands. It was about a father who refused to stay silent when silence would have cost his child her future. The next morning would bring audits, questions, possibly new threats from whoever had orchestrated the deeper infiltration. But tonight, the battlefield was quiet. He turned off the living room light and walked down the hallway, pausing briefly at his daughter's door. He listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Protected. That was enough. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title, and we'll step into another battle together. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, They Fired the Night Guard, until the CEO discovered who he really was. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?